In the autumn of 1982, in a county courthouse in West Palm Beach, Florida, a borrowed grocery cart sat parked beside a coin-operated copy machine. Inside the cart was the entire evidence file of the most scandalous divorce in America. The tax returns, the photographs, a small tin trumpet. All of it, stacked in a shopping cart, open to anyone who walked in with a dime. I have gone back to that grocery cart more often than I can explain, because everyone remembers this case the same way. They remember it as the divorce so filthy, so dangerous to a famous name, that the family had it sealed, locked away, hidden from the public forever. That is the story that has followed the Pulitzer name for 40 years. And it is wrong. Nothing was sealed. The whole thing sat in a cart by a copier, a dime a page, the entire time. Consider a few things before we go any further. A Hungarian immigrant who arrived in America as a paid army recruit, barely able to speak English, and within 20 years owned the most powerful newspaper in New York. The man who created the most respected prize in American journalism, funded by the profits of the loudest scandal sheets of his age. A divorce trial that ran for about 3 weeks and produced sworn testimony about cocaine, a French baker, a Grand Prix driver, and a seance trumpet at the foot of the marital bed. A wife who told the court the family fortune was worth $25 million, and a husband who swore under oath it was worth $2.5 million. A judge who quoted a country song from the bench, took the children away from their mother, and gave her 2 weeks to leave the house. A newspaper company that would sell, 2 decades later, for $1.5 billion, while the family's private fortune was eventually saved from foreclosure by the 5th husband of the woman they had crushed. And the court records that everyone believes were sealed, that were never sealed at all, sitting in that grocery cart beside that copy machine. Every one of those things is documented, and the strangest part is not any single one of them. It is that the whole country watched, and still managed to remember it backward. This is the story of a divorce so lurid that everyone remembers it as the case the rich made disappear. It is also the story of how nothing disappeared at all, how every page of it sat in a grocery cart by a public copier, and how the real power of a great name was not to hide the fight, but to win it in front of everyone. I want to start in that courthouse, with that cart, because the cart is the thing that tells you the truth, and almost no one ever looks at it. Before we go on, one quick thing. If you subscribe, it helps build a community around these and rewards the work that goes into them. And it is free. Chapter 1. The Grocery Cart. The courthouse in West Palm Beach in the autumn of 1982 was not a quiet place. The trial of Pulitzer versus Pulitzer had turned it into a circus, with reporters from every wire service and tabloid in the country crammed into the halls, a closed-circuit television camera running in the courtroom, and the whole proceeding watchable on a screen across the corridor. Florida law at the time required that camera. The state had a long and serious tradition of open government, of what were called sunshine laws, rules that kept the public business of courts and agencies genuinely public. A trial was a public proceeding, and a divorce trial, however famous the names involved, was no exception. The cameras rolled, the gallery filled, and the wire services filed copy by the hour, so the evidence lived in the open. According to the writer Hunter Thompson, who covered the trial up close, the entire evidence file was wheeled around the building in a borrowed grocery cart. Tax returns, financial statements, photographs, and the now famous tin trumpet, all of it in one shopping cart. And when court was not in session, that cart was parked beside a copying machine in the county clerk's office, available for public inspection at all times, copyable by anyone who wanted a page, at the press rate of a dime and the public rate of $1. There was no guard on it. There was no special permission required. The file did not live in a sealed vault somewhere in the basement. It lived in a shopping cart, in a public office, beside a machine that took coins. Sit with that image for a moment, because it is the key to the whole story. The most scandalous divorce in America, the one everyone to this day describes as sealed, was sitting in a shopping cart next to a copy machine, and a tourist could have walked in off the street and photocopied the tax returns of one of the most famous families in the country. Reporters did exactly that, by the hundreds of pages. The trumpet that became a national punchline was in that cart. The financial records that became the heart of the money fight were in that cart. There was no vault, no locked drawer, no quiet order from a friendly judge. There was a grocery cart, a copier, and a coin slot. There was exactly one measure of secrecy in the entire case. Judge Carl Harper issued a gag order, an instruction forbidding the two parties and their lawyers from discussing the case with reporters. That was the whole of it. Not a sealed file. Not a closed courtroom. A single order telling a handful of people to keep their mouths shut. And by every account, including Thompson's, the gag order was violated almost constantly and made very little difference, because the evidence everyone wanted was already out there in the cart. So where did the myth come from? I think it came from an assumption, a very natural one. When ordinary people imagine the very rich getting divorced, they imagine secrecy. They imagine money buying silence, files vanishing into a vault, judges quietly cooperating, the whole ugly business made to disappear. It is what we expect wealth to do, and most of the time we are probably right to expect it. Sealing court records is a real tool, and it is a tool the rich use more than anyone. So when people heard, years later, that a Pulitzer divorce had been unspeakably filthy, the mind filled in the rest. Of course it was sealed. A family like that would never let all of it hang out in public, and so a story that was in fact almost grotesquely public got remembered as its opposite, because the opposite is what we believe about people like the Pulitzers. The truth was stranger and worse than the myth. Nobody hid anything. Nobody needed to. The Pulitzer name did not protect the family by drawing a curtain over the fight. It protected the side that could afford the better lawyers, the longer trial, and the small army of witnesses, and it did all of that out in the open, where anyone with a dime could watch. To understand how a family with a name like that ended up with its most private moments in a grocery cart, you have to go back more than a century, to a half-blind teenager who stepped off a boat with no money and a name nobody in America could pronounce. Chapter 2. The recruit Joseph Pulitzer was born in Hungary in 1847, in a town called Mako, the son of a comfortable merchant family that fell on hard times. He was tall, painfully thin, with weak eyes that would eventually fail him almost completely, and as a young man he wanted to be a soldier. He tried to enlist in several European armies, the Austrians, the French Foreign Legion, the British, and one after another they turned him away, for his weak eyes and his thin frame. He was, on paper, exactly the kind of young man no army wanted. Then, in 1864, an American recruiting agent offered him a different path. The United States was in the middle of its Civil War, and the Union Army was paying bounties to men willing to enlist. Agents went to Europe looking for bodies. Pulitzer signed on as a paid substitute, a man hired to serve in place of someone wealthy enough to avoid the draft, and he crossed the Atlantic to fight in a war that was not his, for a country whose language he did not speak. He served in a New York cavalry regiment for the last months of the war, a unit with many German-speaking soldiers, which spared him the worst of the isolation. He saw little real fighting. By the standards of the men around him, he was an oddity, a bookish foreigner who could barely see and who spent his spare hours reading rather than gambling or drinking. When the war ended, he made his way to St. Louis, a city with a large German-speaking population, where a man with his languages could get by. He took the jobs an immigrant could get, and he hated most of them. He tended mules at a livery stable, work he spoke of with disgust for the rest of his life. He waited tables until, by one story, he dropped a dish of food on a customer and was let go. He worked as a clerk and a laborer and a stevedore on the riverfront. And in his spare hours he read, in the library of a German social club, teaching himself law and English and the workings of his adopted country, with a ferocity that the people around him remembered for the rest of their lives. He was a man in a hurry, though he could not yet have told you toward what. The newspapers found him before he found them. He was hired as a reporter for a German-language daily in St. Louis, and he turned out to be relentless, the kind of reporter who chased a story until it gave up. He made enemies easily, because he went after them in print without much caution. He once got into a physical confrontation with a man he had attacked in his reporting, a lobbyist, and ended up shooting him in the leg. He was fined for it, and he survived the scandal, which tells you something about both the man and the rough newspaper world he was climbing through. He passed the bar, though he barely practiced law. He won a seat in the Missouri state legislature. He moved from reporting into editing, and then into the strange new business of owning the press, rather than merely writing for it, buying up small, struggling papers and stitching them together. The decisive moment came in December of 1878. A bankrupt little paper called the St. Louis Dispatch was put up for sale at a sheriff's auction, and Pulitzer bought it for around $2,500. It came with something more valuable than its presses: a membership in the Associated Press Wire. Within days, he merged it with another struggling paper, the Post, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch was born. He was 31 years old, and he finally owned the thing he had been racing toward. I find his early life almost difficult to believe, even with the documents in front of me. A half-blind foreign teenager, hired to take a rich man's place in a war, who taught himself a country from the floor of a library and came out the other side owning one of its newspapers. It is the kind of rise that does not really happen, except that it did. What he built next would make him one of the most influential men in America, and it would attach his name to the very best and the very worst of what newspapers can do at the same time. If you have made it this far, you should probably subscribe. It is free, and it is what keeps these coming. Chapter 3. The World. In May of 1883, Joseph Pulitzer bought a newspaper that was losing money. The New York World, owned by the railroad financier Jay Gould, was bleeding something like $40,000 a year, and Gould was glad to be rid of it. Pulitzer paid $346,000 for it, a large sum for a failing paper, and almost everyone thought he had overpaid for a corpse. Within a few years, the World was the most widely read newspaper in the United States, and Pulitzer had turned a corpse into the most profitable paper in the country. He did it by deciding that the newspaper was for everyone, not just the educated and the comfortable. He cut the price to 2 cents, and later a penny. He filled the paper with crime, with scandal, with disaster, with crusades against corruption and big business, and with stunts that no one had ever seen before. He hired a young woman named Nellie Bly and had her commit herself, undercover, to a mental asylum so she could expose the conditions inside, and the series made her famous. Then he sent her around the world in an attempt to beat the fictional record of 80 days from the Jules Verne novel. And she did it in 72, and the entire country followed her progress by telegraph like a sporting event. It was news as entertainment, news as spectacle, and it sold papers by the hundreds of thousands. Circulation climbed past 600,000, numbers that had never been reached before. Then came the rivalry that defined the era. A young man named William Randolph Hearst, the heir to a mining fortune, bought the rival New York Journal and set out to beat Pulitzer at his own game, hiring away his best people and outdoing his most sensational stories. The two papers pushed each other into ever louder, ever wilder territory. Screaming headlines, dubious facts, a frenzy of circulation at any cost. The style got a name, taken from a comic strip character, a boy in a yellow nightshirt, that both papers fought to publish. They called it yellow journalism, and the term has never lost its sting. It came to mean exactly the kind of journalism the Pulitzer name would later be invoked to oppose: sensational, careless with the truth, hungry for outrage. Some historians argue this brand of coverage helped push the country into the Spanish-American War, with both papers beating the drum for a fight that sold papers beautifully. Whatever the truth of that, the world was loud, and it was enormous, and it made Pulitzer one of the most formidable private citizens in the country, a man whose paper could make or break a politician and start or stop a public panic. He had built something genuinely new, a mass newspaper for a mass democracy, and he had built it out of equal parts public service and pure sensation. The crusades against corruption running on the same pages as the stunts and the screaming crime stories. Here is the part I keep returning to. The most sensational, least responsible, most aggressive newspaper of its age was built by Joseph Pulitzer. The name that today means the highest standard in American journalism, the name a reporter dreams of having attached to their work, belonged first to the man who helped invent the gutter. The Pulitzer name has carried both of those things from the very beginning. The honor and the scandal, twined together, impossible to fully separate. It is worth saying plainly, the Pulitzers were never only respectable. The respectability was something Joseph bought, deliberately, late in life, with the profits of all that noise. Because by his 50s, Pulitzer was almost completely blind, and increasingly unable to bear noise, so that he spent his later years on a soundproofed yacht and in soundproofed rooms, running his empire through a small army of secretaries who read the world to him aloud. As he aged and darkened and grew obsessed with his own legacy, he began to think hard about how he would be remembered. He had made himself fabulously rich and widely feared. He had also made himself, in the eyes of much of polite society, a vulgarian, a peddler of filth who had dragged American journalism into the mud for money. And he decided to do something about it, to build, out of the proceeds of yellow journalism, a monument to the opposite. The instrument he chose would outlive every newspaper he ever owned, and it would protect his name long after the family had lost the papers entirely. Chapter 4. The Prize. When Joseph Pulitzer died in 1911, aboard his yacht in a harbor in South Carolina, he left behind a will that did something unusual. He gave $2 million to Columbia University in New York, to do two things he had failed to persuade anyone to do while he was alive. The first was to found a school of journalism, to make the trade he had practiced into a profession, something taught and dignified rather than just hustled. The second was to establish a set of annual prizes for excellence in journalism and in letters, a way of rewarding, every year, the very best of the work he had so often debased. Columbia had turned down the journalism school when he first proposed it during his life. Only after his death, and his money, did the university agree. It took years after his death for the plan to take shape, but in 1917, the first Pulitzer Prizes were awarded. They went to work in journalism, in history, in biography, in drama, and over the following century they became the thing every American writer and reporter measures themselves against. To win one is to be told, by the establishment of your own field, that your work mattered, that it met the highest standard the profession has. The man who had built his fortune on stunts and screaming headlines had purchased, for $2 million, a permanent seat at the head of the table of serious journalism. It is one of the most successful acts of reputation building in American history. We say the word Pulitzer now, and we hear excellence, integrity, the public good. We do not hear Nellie Bly circling the globe for circulation, or the yellow press howling toward a war. The prize ate the man. There is a detail in how he set it up that turns out to matter enormously, and it is the kind of thing that sounds like dry administration until you see what it protects. The prizes were not given to the Pulitzer Newspaper Company, they were given to Columbia University, and they are administered by the university and an independent board. They were never owned by the family business at all. The honor and the company were two separate things from the very first day. I want to slow down on that, because it is the quiet hinge of this entire story. Joseph Pulitzer, perhaps without fully meaning to, split his own name into two pieces. One piece was the family, and its newspapers and its fortune. which could rise and fall and embarrass itself and eventually be sold off to strangers. The other piece was the prize, locked safely inside a university, untouchable, beyond the reach of any scandal the family could ever generate. He built a firewall between his reputation and his relatives, and he built it so well that almost no one has ever noticed it is there. Think about what that means in practice. A descendant of Joseph Pulitzer could be accused on national television of cocaine and adultery and worse, and the Pulitzer Prize would be awarded that same spring, in the same name, entirely untouched, because the two things had never been connected in the first place. The honor was not the family's to lose. It belonged to a university and a board, and they owed the relatives nothing. Every spring since 1917, through depressions and wars and the slow collapse of the family's own newspapers, the prizes have been announced in the same name, from the same campus, untouched by anything a Pulitzer in Florida or anywhere else might do. That firewall would be tested. The newspapers passed down through three careful, capable generations of Pulitzers in St. Louis. His son, Joseph II, ran the Post-Dispatch for 43 years and is widely credited with preserving the family's journalistic stature even after the New York World was sold and folded in the early 1930s. His grandson, another Joseph, edited and published the paper for decades more and chaired the Pulitzer Prize board for 31 years. They were serious men who kept the family's journalistic honor intact for the better part of a century. And the Post-Dispatch won prizes of its own, the very prizes their grandfather had endowed. Whatever else happened to the family, the newspaper in St. Louis remained a genuinely respected institution, run by people who understood exactly what the name was supposed to stand for. It is worth holding on to that, because it makes the Florida story stranger by contrast. The same name, in the same years, meant two completely different things in two different states. But the fortune had other branches. In time, the St. Louis Company would take itself public, in 1986, after a bitter fight among the founders' descendants over whether to cash out. But the journalistic core held for decades, and one of the family's branches ran south, to Florida, to a grandson who had no interest in newspapers at all, and who would attach the Pulitzer name to a spectacle that the blind old man on his soundproofed yacht could never have imagined. Hit subscribe if you want the next one. It costs nothing, and it takes a second. Chapter 5. Palm Beach, Florida, is a narrow barrier island, a strip of sand and old money, between a lake and the ocean, and in the early 1980s, it was home to fewer than 10,000 people. They were, on average, among the wealthiest people in the country. The island ran on inherited fortunes, on golf and tennis and charity galas, on long lunches and longer marriages, and a kind of sealed, sun-bleached privacy that the residents took entirely for granted. People did not air their troubles in Palm Beach. That was, in a sense, what Palm Beach was for. It was also, by the early 80s, sitting at the very edge of the largest cocaine economy the United States had ever seen. South Florida was the entry point for most of the cocaine coming into the country, and the money and the powder seeped upward into every social layer, including the highest. The same island of charity galas and inherited fortunes was awash in a drug that had, almost overnight, become fashionable among exactly the people who could afford it. That detail matters, because it would sit at the center of everything that happened in that courtroom. Into that world fits Herbert Peter Pulitzer Jr., known to everyone as Peter, born in 1930, a grandson of the founding Joseph Pulitzer. He was a Pulitzer, but he was not a newspaper Pulitzer. He had dropped out of college, taken something like $500,000 of family money, and built, in Florida, a fortune that had nothing to do with the press. He owned citrus groves, including a grapefruit operation of around 800 acres, and cattle ranches. He owned a wildly popular Palm Beach restaurant where the island's wealthy ate and drank. He had helped found a hotel in Amsterdam that still carries the Pulitzer name. He had taken a modest stake of family money and turned it into a substantial fortune of his own, entirely in the soil and the sunshine of Florida and abroad, with nothing to do with ink or newsprint. He was a rancher and a businessman, and a fixture of Palm Beach society, handsome and weathered and rich, and the St. Louis newspapers must have felt very far away. His first marriage had been to the woman who built the Lilly Pulitzer fashion label, the bright printed shift dresses that became a kind of uniform for a certain class of American woman. She had started selling the dresses from a juice stand, using fruit from the family groves, and after Jacqueline Kennedy, who knew her, was photographed wearing one, the look spread across the country and became a brand still recognized today. That marriage ended around 1969, after roughly 17 years and 3 children. The Pulitzer name, in Palm Beach, already meant citrus and fashion and money, long before it meant scandal. Peter Pulitzer was, by the late 1970s, a wealthy divorced man in late middle age, living exactly the life the island was designed for. I want to pause here on the two fortunes, because the gap between them is the engine of everything that follows. There was the newspaper fortune in Missouri, disciplined and serious and watched over by men who understood that the family name was a public trust. And there was the Florida fortune, citrus and cattle and sunshine, run by a man whose idea of the family business was a grapefruit grove and a good restaurant. Same name, same blood, completely different worlds. The men in St. Louis had spent their lives guarding the family name as a public trust, weighing every decision against the honor attached to it. The man in Florida was, by all accounts, simply living his life, a rich rancher on a beautiful island. And it was the Florida world, not the newspaper world, the citrus and not the ink, that was about to put the Pulitzer name on every front page in America for an entirely new reason, the very kind of reason Joseph had spent $2 million trying to bury. By the standards of Palm Beach, none of this was unusual. A rich older man, a couple of marriages behind him, a large house on the water, a comfortable life among people exactly like himself. What was unusual was about to walk into it. In the mid-1970s, at a party thrown by her employer, the millionaire in his mid-40s was introduced to an insurance saleswoman in her early 20s from a small town in upstate New York. Her name was Roxanne. She was blonde, striking, and ambitious, a long way from home and a longer way from money. Within a few years, she would be the most talked-about woman in America, and not in any way she would have chosen. Chapter 6. Roxanne. Roxanne Renkins was born in 1951 in Cassadaga, New York, which is a detail that will matter later in a way that is almost too neat to believe. Cassadaga is a tiny place in the western part of the state, and it sits right beside Lily Dale, the most famous spiritualist community in America, a settlement founded by people who believed the living could speak with the dead. The woman who would one day be mocked across the country for keeping a seance trumpet grew up next door to the American capital of seances, a community built by people who held sittings to reach the dead. Nobody invents a coincidence like that. It simply happened. Whatever Roxanne believed or did not believe as an adult, the practice that the tabloids would treat as proof of her madness was, where she came from, ordinary, almost a local industry. Her background was the opposite of Peter's in every way that counted. She came from a working family, without money or connections. She had been a cheerleader. She had married young, to a man named Peter Dixon, and that marriage had ended. She had drifted south, and by the mid-1970s, she was in Florida, selling insurance, making her own way on her own paycheck, a long distance in every sense from the inherited fortunes of Palm Beach. She was attractive, energetic, and ambitious, the kind of person who works her way into rooms she was not born into. She was, in the language of that world, nobody, which is to say, she was like almost everyone who is not born into a name. She met Peter Pulitzer at a party her boss was throwing. He was a wealthy man more than 20 years her senior, recently divorced, a fixture of the island. She was young, blonde and ambitious. The attraction, in both directions, is not hard to understand. They married early in 1976, a wealthy man past the middle of his life, and a young woman just starting hers. The following year, on the 28th of August 1977, she gave birth to twin boys, McLean and Zachary, known as Mac and Zach. For a few years it was, on the surface, a Palm Beach marriage like many others. There was the big house on the water, on North Lake Way, the boats, the social calendar, the parties, the children. Roxanne had crossed, in a single marriage, from selling insurance to running a household with the Pulitzer name on the mailbox. For a woman from a working family in upstate New York, it must have felt like arriving somewhere permanent. It was not permanent. Almost nothing on that island was, for the people who married into it, rather than being born into it. Roxanne had married into one of the most famous names in America, and for a while, she lived the life that came with it. But underneath the surface, by the accounts that would later come out in court, there was a great deal of cocaine, a great deal of drinking, and a marriage coming apart at the seams. This was Palm Beach in the years when cocaine had become almost a social currency among the wealthy, and both spouses, by the testimony, were deep in it. Who introduced whom? Who used more? Who was the worse influence? All of that became a weapon later. At the time, it was simply the texture of a certain kind of moneyed life in South Florida at the turn of the 80s. How much of what was later alleged was true, and how much was exaggeration produced by a brutal legal fight, is something we will have to be careful about. I want to slow down here, because the class gap between these two people is the engine of everything that follows, and it is easy to lose it in the noise of the scandal. Peter Pulitzer had a name that opened every door, a fortune built over decades, and the ability to hire the best lawyers in the state and keep them for as long as it took. Roxanne had a marriage certificate. When the marriage failed, those two starting positions were not remotely equal, and the law, as it was actually practiced in that courtroom, would do nothing to make them equal. It would do the opposite. The thing people imagine protects a spouse in a divorce, some neutral machinery that splits things down the middle, is a good deal weaker in practice than in theory. And it is weakest precisely when one side can afford to fight without limit, and the other cannot afford to fight at all. By 1982, the marriage was over in everything but law, and Peter filed for divorce. He wanted the divorce, and he wanted custody of the twins, and he had the resources to pursue both with overwhelming force. What happened next was not really a trial in the sense the word usually implies, two sides meeting on equal ground. It was the full weight of the Pulitzer name and the Pulitzer money coming down on one side of a marriage, in the most public way imaginable. Subscribing is how stories like this keep reaching you, and it stays free. Chapter 7. 19 days. The trial of Pulitzer versus Pulitzer ran for roughly 3 weeks in the autumn of 1982, something like 18 or 19 days of testimony, before Judge Carl Harper in West Palm Beach. It was a media event on a scale that a divorce had rarely reached before. Reporters came from across the country and from overseas. The wire services filed daily. The closed-circuit television carried it across the courthouse hall, and the tabloids treated each day's testimony as the next installment of a serial. Before any of what was said in that courtroom is described, a warning belongs here, one worth keeping in mind for the rest of this story. Because almost everything that made this case famous belongs in a category that is not the same as fact. What happened in that courtroom was a series of allegations, sworn to by interested parties in the middle of a vicious fight over money and children, and then amplified, sharpened, and in some cases, simply invented by a tabloid press in a feeding frenzy. Years later, a federal court looking at one piece of the coverage found that certain widely repeated details, things that everyone by then assumed were established, had never actually been testified to at all. They were press embellishments. So when these things are described as alleged, hear that word under every sentence. The point of this chapter is not the dirt, The point is what the dirt was used to do. With that said, here is the shape of it. Peter's side alleged that Roxanne was a heavy cocaine user. They alleged a series of affairs, with a local real estate salesman, with a French baker, with a Belgian Grand Prix driver, and with a man described as a drug dealer. They alleged an affair between Roxanne and another woman, the much younger wife of an elderly tissue fortune heir. Both spouses testified to encounters involving that third person, who for her part called Peter deranged. The allegations came thick and strange, and each one made a better headline than the last, which was, in a sense, the point of producing so many of them. And then there were the séances, which we will come to in a moment, because the séances became the whole case in the public mind. Roxanne's side told a different story. She alleged that it was Peter who had introduced her to cocaine, that he had smuggled marijuana, that he had threatened her, and there was an exchange of the ugliest possible allegations between Roxanne and Peter's adult daughter from his first marriage. Roxanne alleged, in essence, an improper relationship between Peter and his grown daughter. The daughter, who was in her 20s, testified to the reverse, describing an advance she said Roxanne had made toward her. Those competing claims are best left exactly there, as competing claims between adults, unproven on both sides, because that is all the record will actually support, and because dwelling on them is to do precisely what the trial did, which was to turn a family's worst moments into entertainment. What matters here is the machinery. On one side of this fight stood Peter Pulitzer, who could field a parade of witnesses, many of them people who worked for him, his household staff, a former nanny, servants, a former psychic advisor of Roxanne's who switched sides and testified against her. He could field a former nanny who testified about what she said she had seen, household servants, and even a woman who had once been Roxanne's own psychic advisor and who switched sides to testify against her. He could afford a legal bill that ran, by one estimate, to $500,000 and counting, with perhaps $1 million more to come. On the other side stood Roxanne, who at one point would have to borrow money from her mother for an apartment. The money fight made the asymmetry literal. Roxanne told the court the family fortune was worth $25 million. Peter testified it was worth $2.5 million, a tenth as much, and his accountant claimed the net worth had fallen by exactly that gap over the course of the marriage, somehow, blaming her spending. There is no way both of those numbers are honest, and the truth almost certainly sat somewhere neither side wanted to admit, but the dispute itself tells you how total the war was. Fought down to the last decimal place of a fortune nobody would state plainly. She submitted a schedule of expenses of something like $250,000 a year, a number Peter's side held up as proof of her greed, including a line of several $1,000s for birthday presents for the twins' friends. It was the kind of detail that plays terribly in a newspaper and tells you very little about who was actually telling the truth about the money. It was, in other words, not a contest. It was a demonstration, a show of force conducted in front of cameras. A marriage between two people with wildly unequal resources had ended, and the dissolution of it was being conducted on terms that one of them set and the other could only endure. And sitting in the middle of all of it, wheeled in with the rest of the evidence and admitted by a baffled judge, was a small tin trumpet. If you have made it this deep into the story, you are exactly who these are made for. Subscribe, and they keep coming. Chapter 8. The Trumpet. The trumpet was the kind of detail that a trial like this one is really about, even though it had nothing to do with custody or money or the law. Peter testified that Roxanne held séances in their bedroom, sittings attended by a number of people, with a trumpet and a black cape placed at the foot of the bed. The idea, in the spiritualist tradition Roxanne had grown up around in Casadaga, was that a spirit might use the trumpet to amplify its voice, that the dead might speak to the living through the horn. Roxanne, on the stand, explained more or less exactly that. She said she had hoped the dead would speak to the living through the trumpet. It was, to anyone from Casadaga, an unremarkable thing to say. It was, to a courtroom full of reporters from New York and a judge in Palm Beach, the most quotable sentence of the entire trial. The gap between those two reactions, between the practice as it was lived and the practice as it was broadcast, is the gap the whole case lived inside. Peter testified, dryly, that he did not believe in any spirit voices, and that he had been kicked out of the seances for falling asleep during them. It was a good line, and it got the laugh it was built to get. The picture it painted, of a sensible husband enduring his wife's nonsense, did exactly the work it was meant to do. There is a question worth asking about why any of this was in a custody trial at all. A woman's spiritual beliefs, however unusual, have nothing to do with whether she is a fit mother, and the seances harmed no one. But that was never the function of the trumpet in the courtroom. Its function was to make Roxanne look strange, unstable, not quite respectable, and in a case decided partly on conduct and character, looking strange was dangerous. When Roxanne's lawyers tried to keep the trumpet out of the trial as irrelevant, Judge Harper admitted it into evidence anyway. By the account that has come down to us, he said, more or less, that he could not for the life of him see how it was relevant, and then he let it in regardless. And that single decision, to admit a tin trumpet that the judge himself could not connect to any legal question, tells you what kind of proceeding this had become. It was no longer only a divorce. It was a show, and the trumpet was the prop the show had been waiting for. The tabloids did the rest. The New York Post ran a headline announcing, in the first person, that she had slept with a trumpet, and the nickname was born almost instantly. They called her the Strumpet with the Trumpet. It was cruel, it was catchy, and it stuck to her for the rest of her life. A woman was reduced, in the national imagination, to a dirty joke about a musical instrument, on the basis of a spiritual practice from the town where she was born. There is a darker footnote here worth stating plainly. Years later, a federal court examining a defamation claim found that some of the most repeated seance details, the lurid specifics that everyone by then took as established, had never actually been testified to. They were inventions of the coverage. The trumpet was real. A good deal of what was hung on it was not. I find the trumpet the saddest object in this entire story, and I want to explain why. Because it is easy to laugh at, and the laughing is the point. A tin trumpet is worth almost nothing. It played no part in the legal decision, and yet it did more damage to Roxanne Pulitzer's life than any ruling the judge could hand down, because a financial judgment can be appealed, and a humiliation cannot. Once the country is laughing at you, there is no court you can go to. The trumpet was admitted into evidence in a courtroom, but the sentence it carried was handed down everywhere else, and it was permanent. There is a detail that closes the loop on the trumpet in a way no screenwriter would dare. A few years after the trial, when Roxanne posed for the cover of a famous magazine, she posed with a trumpet. She had understood something by then. The trumpet was hers now, whether she wanted it or not, and the only move left was to pick it up herself. It is one of the few moments in the whole saga where you can see her seize the thing that had been used against her and turn it to her own account. The instrument that had been entered into evidence to humiliate her became, on a magazine cover, a prop she controlled. It did not undo the damage. The nickname outlived the gesture, but it was the first sign of the second act she would eventually build out of the wreckage, the refusal to simply disappear into the joke they had made of her. When the testimony finally ended, after roughly 3 weeks of it, Judge Harper sat down to write a decision that the reporters who had covered that courthouse for their entire careers would still be talking about decades later. Chapter 9. The Shaft. The judgment came down at the end of December 1982. Judge Harper found that Roxanne had committed what he called flagrant acts of adultery and other gross marital misconduct. On the strength of that finding, he set aside the usual presumption of the era, the idea that very young children belonged with their mother, and he gave custody of the twins to Peter. For a mother to lose custody of 5-year-old children in 1982 was a severe and unusual outcome. He had done it on the basis of conduct. The conduct that Peter's battalion of witnesses had spent 3 weeks parading through the courtroom. The money followed the same logic. Roxanne had asked for around $144,000 a year in alimony. What she received was $48,000 in total, $2,000 a month for 2 years, what the court called rehabilitative alimony, money to get her back on her feet, and then nothing. She kept a Porsche that had been bought with Peter's money, around $60,000 in jewelry mostly bought with his money, a few $1,000s of equity in a boat, and $100,000 or so in attorney's fees. There is a detail that sharpens the whole judgment. Before the trial, Peter had reportedly offered her far more than she ended up with: a yearly sum, several years in the house, and a home of her own, in exchange for custody of the boys. She had turned it down and gone to trial for the children, and she had come out of the trial with less money and no children at all. Every other claim was denied. She was given 2 weeks to leave the house. It is worth stopping on the size of that award, because numbers like these only mean something in comparison. In 1982, the median income for an American family was around $23,000 a year. Roxanne's entire settlement, the $48,000, came to about 2 years of a typical family's income. To almost anyone watching, that was a real sum of money. By the standards of an ordinary household, it was a windfall. But she had been married to a man whose fortune she put at $25 million, and she had asked for a fraction of it, and she had walked away with the equivalent of 2 years of ordinary wages and the loss of her children. Against the scale of the Pulitzer fortune, it was nothing, a rounding error. Against the scale of an ordinary life, it was the difference between everything and nothing, and she had landed on the wrong side of it. That double measure is the whole class story of the case in a single award. The same $48,000 was a fortune and an insult at the same time, depending only on which world you were standing in when you heard the number. The judge was not finished with her either. In his written decision, he reached for a country song, the one about getting the gold mine and getting the shaft, to characterize what he plainly thought of her demands. He wrote that her requests shocked the conscience of the court. To the reporters who had covered that courthouse, it did not read like a divorce so much as a rout, the look of overwhelming force meeting someone who could not answer it. And that impression stuck in the memory of the people who had watched the whole thing unfold. That was the sense that went around, that this had not been a divorce so much as a beating administered through legal means, in public, with the law's full approval. I want to be careful and fair here, because this is the heart of the matter. The law that Judge Harper applied was not, on its face, a law designed to crush anyone. Florida was a no-fault divorce state, but misconduct could still color custody and the division of property. And in a fight where one side could afford to document the other side's every alleged sin with a parade of paid witnesses, no fault in theory became something very different in practice. The neutral-sounding law became a weapon, and it went to the hand that could afford to lift it. Roxanne appealed. She appealed 3 times, and 3 times the courts upheld what Judge Harper had done. There was no technical flaw to seize on, because Harper had stayed within the wide discretion the law gave him. That is the quiet horror of it. The result that looked, to the reporters in that courthouse, like a rout was not a violation of the law. It was the law, working exactly as written, in the hands of the side that could afford to use all of it. A celebrity attorney took her case for a while without charge, drawn by the publicity, then drifted away as the publicity faded. She had lost her children, lost the fight, and lost her name to a cruel nickname, and she had almost nothing left. So she did the only thing left to a woman whose private life had already been made completely public. She decided to sell it herself, on her own terms, for once. Chapter 10. The Pendulum. What Roxanne did next was, in its way, the most resourceful thing in the entire story. She wrote a book. In 1987, she published her own account of the marriage and the trial. She called it The Prize Pulitzer, a deliberate play on the very award the family name was attached to. And it became a national bestseller, her version of events reaching far more people than any single day of testimony ever had. She posed for the magazine cover, the one with the trumpet, reportedly for around $70,000, at a time when she was working as an aerobics instructor and struggling with her legal bills. Her story became a television movie, in which she appeared briefly as herself. She wrote novels afterward. She took the only asset the trial had left her, the notoriety, the very thing that had been built to destroy her, and she made it pay. There is something bracing in that. A woman who had been turned into a punchline picking up the punchline and selling tickets to it. It would be easy to call that a happy ending, and it was not quite that. But it was survival. And survival, for the side that loses a fight like this one, is its own kind of victory. And then, slowly, the thing that nobody in that courtroom would have predicted began to happen. The money moved. Peter Pulitzer's fortune, the citrus and the cattle and the land, ran into trouble. In 2006, a disease called citrus canker tore through the family groves and destroyed something like 88,000 grapefruit trees. And the operation Peter ran with his sons slid toward foreclosure on a mortgage of more than $1 million. The grapefruit money, the very fortune whose size had been fought over so bitterly in 1982, was failing in the ground. The Pulitzer fortune in Florida, the one that had crushed Roxanne so completely, was running dry. The detail that closes the circle is almost unbelievable. In around 2011, the people who rescued Peter Pulitzer and his sons from that financial hole, who guaranteed mortgages and loans totaling well over $1.5 million, included Roxanne's fifth husband. The woman the Pulitzer money had routed so completely in 1982 was, 3 decades later, married to a man whose money helped keep the Pulitzer groves out of foreclosure. Roxanne, asked about it, said she had never thought Peter would run out of money, and that the pendulum swings. Peter Pulitzer died in 2018, at the age of 88, at home, on the same island where it had all played out. Now step back from all of it for a moment, because the chronology has run its course, and the shape it leaves behind is not the shape anyone expects. It would be easy to tell this as a story about a dirty divorce, about cocaine and seances and a trumpet, the way the tabloids told it, and the way it is mostly remembered. That is the easy version, and it misses everything that matters. It would be just as easy to tell it as the story the title promises, the rich family that sealed the records to hide their shame. But there were no sealed records. That is the one thing this story is really about. What strikes me, after all of it, is that the case is remembered almost perfectly backward. We remember secrecy, and there was none. We remember hidden files, and the files sat in a grocery cart. The real Pulitzer power in that courtroom was never the power to conceal. It was the power to win, completely and publicly, against someone who could not match it, and then to let the winning stand in full view, because nothing in that view threatened them at all. The shame the family supposedly hid was never theirs. It was hung, by the press and the verdict, entirely on her. What survived is its own kind of answer. The newspaper company survived, and was sold in 2005 to a chain from Iowa for $1.5 billion, the Pulitzer name coming off the mastheads in the deal. The prizes survived, untouched, exactly as Joseph had built them, sitting inside a university where no family scandal could ever reach them, still arriving every spring. Roxanne survived, with her book and her nickname and her hard-won second act. What did not survive was the marriage, the custody, and above all the comfortable belief that a story like this one must have been hidden away. Go back, one last time, to that county courthouse in West Palm Beach, in the autumn of 1982. The borrowed grocery cart parked beside the coin-operated copy machine. The tax returns, the photographs, the small tin trumpet, all of it stacked in the cart. open to anyone who walked in with a dime. It is the same cart the story opened on. It looks different now. It is not an administrative oddity, a quirk of Florida paperwork. It is the truest object in the entire case, more honest than any headline and any ruling, sitting there in the open while the whole country told itself the records had been locked away. There was no seal, and there was no secret. There was only a grocery cart beside a copy machine, and a name powerful enough that it never needed to hide a thing. This is what this channel is for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.